Welcome to this book talk from Al-Mahdi Institute on behalf of the Center of Intra-Muslim Studies. Today, we are very privileged and honored to have with us Associate Professor from the American Islamic College in Chicago, Professor Shabana Mir. And I'm going to be talking to her today about her award-winning book on the back of her research, the book named Muslim American Women on Campus. And we're going to be talking about that book today. The book, Professor, I've had the privilege of using and citing on numerous instances during my own research based here in the UK. But I want to ask you about the book itself and the research. Earlier this year on our Sims podcast, we discussed how Muslim women are already under scrutiny and how that particular demographic is almost used sometimes as a pressure point on Muslim communities and securitization around them, etc. And of course, because their presence sartorially is much more vivid and apparent, why then did you decide to, and what was the impetus, what was the motivation, your motivation there, to again focus your research on the same demographic group?
So in the year 2000, I was working on my dissertation proposal. And the thought was that I would focus on Muslim American students, but I was still trying to decide whether they were Muslim American high school students or college students. Ultimately, I decided on college students, and the plan was still chugging along when September 11th attacks happened. And when those happened, suddenly my research became a different project. Now it became from the study of a religious student community and their identity and religious struggles, such as religious accommodations and how they practice on campus, things like that. Now it became a study of a student community that was under this heavy surveillance that is multi-layered, right? On the one hand, it's a cultural surveillance of Muslims, and that is not a new thing, right? That is not a new thing. That has been going on for some centuries now in what we call the West. So there was that, of course. But then there was now this new surveillance that had a much closer security lens that treated this population as a security risk in just their existence, right? And so in cultural products such as when people started talking about the reality show called All American Muslims, people started talking about that and talking about Muslims like an internal security threat, right? And you had the same thing here in the UK using the prevent lens, right? And talking about religious practices as being a symbolic almost of a security threat that was just under the surface, right? So these people, they are among us and they are a threat, right? So this was something that I was looking at, and I had been looking at this for some time now through, for example, movies and sort of screen related products and how Muslims are perceived in different historical periods as a danger. And then fast forward, of course, to Afghanistan, right? Where the blue burqa became a symbol of this ancient, almost, danger now to these vulnerable women from which we, the West, must save them. Right? And how must we save them culturally? Of course, we must save them by removing this veil, but also we must save them by going all in militarily. So that set up the legitimation of that argument was set up in visual terms with these Afghan women, and so then then they set up this. So it's kind of really just an argument set up of this military intervention into Afghanistan as being to save this vulnerable population. So around this time, a lot of op-eds were being produced, a lot of TV shows were being produced. You could not hear the end of Muslim women, right? How are we going to save them? What are we going to do to save them? They just need to abandon their faith and their men and their communities and their sartorial practices, all of those things. So there was no end of talk by non-Muslims about Muslim women. So around this time, when I was thinking about my research project, and actually my spouse, Sven, he said, you're actually the person who should really write about this. I'm sick of hearing these like white people talk about Muslim women in this way. And you are the kind of person who should speak back to these people. And so a lot of the project was about that, about saying we are fully capable, thank you very much, of speaking for ourselves and doing for ourselves as well. Step back. Right? We don't need your help, because when you come to help, you screw things up for all of us, right? Just look at the whole Middle East, South Asia region right now. This is what happens when you use us as an excuse to take us down in just every way possible.
Ironically, I'm going to act as ultra devil's advocate here.
All right.
Doesn't putting the lens back on Muslim women then perpetuate that focus on them again, instead of letting that dilute its way out.
Go, right? Let it go. So you would think, right, that if you let it go, they would let it go, but it never does happen. That moment never does happen. Now, when it comes to things like, let's look at Muslim women, let's look at why they wear hijab and things like that, I am not interested in studies like that. I don't do studies like that. But here, what I was interested in was how Muslim women make sense of being themselves, and not just Muslim women, because that's not all they are. They're not walking hijabs. They're not walking like prayer, right? They are full, entire human beings. And that is what I was trying to convey in this book, that these are not a bottled essence of Muslim womanhood. They are various and many, and you cannot sum them up.
And part of that intersexual identity that they have, as you put on the front of your book, is that they're American, they're Muslim American women.
Yes.
Now, what you were just saying just now about in the wider society, Muslims were perceived in a certain way, and certainly Muslim women were perceived in a certain way, which kind of led you to writing an insider's perspective. And you also write in the book about how American Muslim, the term itself, can be seen as some kind of oxymoron in itself. There's a dichotomy there, apparently. And one aspect of that identity is looking at the other. The American is looking at the Muslim, and Muslims are X, Y, and Z. If I flip the question the other way and say, what about Muslims, especially in diasporic context, in America particularly, is there a stereotypical caricature that they have of Americanism, which also distances themselves from that aspect of their own identities, and that can cause a conflict there as well? Or what can we do about that? If that's
so I suppose you're thinking about, say, Occidentalism, which people often call, right? So sort of an isolationist type approach to the dominant majority population, right?
Especially in colonial context.
Especially in colonial context. I would say that... So here I come back again to my sort of comparative lens of how the British political discourse after colonialism is a different animal from American imperialist discourse. And so the Muslim in each of those polities is treated somewhat differently and conceptualized somewhat differently. So, for example, when it comes to the British context, we know that the majority, much of the immigration that took place to Britain in the 50s after independence and so on took place among the laboring classes, people who had, for example, when the dam was constructed and they lost their lands, etc. So they had some money and they came here to the UK and they built the rails and they essentially created infrastructure for this country, right? Now in the United States was very careful not to let in, for a very long time, not to let in too many non-white, non-European immigrants. For a long time, there's a series of court cases that will attest to that. Then you have, after the 1965 Immigration Act, you have more immigrants from Muslim-majority lands coming in, mostly professional and highly skilled professionals. So the United States essentially contributed to that brain drain all over the Muslim world, bringing in the most qualified doctors, surgeons, professors, academics, scientists, all kinds of people like that, right? So there are different histories that we have there, and that relates also to the larger history of the United States as a settler colonial state, versus, Britain as a very different kind of history, as a colonial state, but not a settler in the same way. But the United States has this, its narrative is of a settler state, and so they talk about we are an immigration country, right? Well, you're an immigration country because you're a settler state, really. So really, all of us, I included, I'm a settler in Native American lands, but that is not the sort of the narrative that they buy into. So yeah, sorry, I lost my train of thought.
So how we see Americanism, or how the Muslims
So
as some sort of stereotypified, hedonistic maybe culture that we want to keep away from.
Right. So when we think about the United States, I usually don't call it America because the Americas are North America, South America, Latin America. It belongs to more peoples, but the United States is many different things, right? So the United States includes Middle America, which is, very Christian, very conservative in many ways, but it also includes the sort of the metropolitan centers that are centers of hedonism, etc., all those things as well. So which America, right, are we talking about is sometimes the question. But yes, when Muslim immigrants arrive in a diasporic context like the West, there are, of course, immediately cultural preservation concerns, right? As they were here, same in other parts of Europe, same Australia. So there are cultural preservation concerns that many of these immigrants bring, and in fact I talk about them in my book as well, in that many post-colonial, say for example Pakistani Muslim immigrants came from very westernized families that were not particularly religious, and they come to the United States and then they have children and then they say, well, actually we're really religious people and you must not talk to boys, right? So it's interesting how people will adjust for the purposes of cultural preservation and identity preservation due to the presence of a dominant majority that has a track record of assimilation. It's not just Muslims that have been assimilated in the past. Many others, for example, Eastern European Jews, when they came to the United States, also there was a widespread assimilation, a pressure to assimilate European migrants, for example, peasants, etc., that moved all over the prairie, for example, very quickly lost their languages, their names, and their cultural practices and everything in order to become part of the Anglo-dominant majority. So that is really at the heart of it, the American establishment. right? And so when we think of what is America and what are we assimilating into, we're thinking on the cultural context, we're thinking about the political context. Now, there are plenty of Muslim Americans who are very happy to assimilate into the American establishment. And when I think about assimilating, it would be, of course, cultural practices, becoming part of the dominant institutions, working on Capitol Hill, etc. And also, maybe even changing your names, things like that. So there's a real range. There's a huge continuum across the board. And I think now what we face is the ethical challenge of where do we draw the lines? Is it really only going to be, now personally I don't drink, etc., but is it only going to be about like pork and alcohol and wearing a scarf? Or are there going to be larger ethical issues where we are going to draw the line? So, for example, plenty of Muslims work in the weapons industry. Plenty of Muslims work with the cops and the security intelligence community. We lived in D.C. We know this. There are plenty of Muslims who are very comfortable in those kinds of contexts. So where exactly do we draw the line? I think there are now those broader questions are being asked that are not purely about symbolism and visibility. Because up until now, I feel like most of the questions about identity were about symbols and visibility, diet, things like that.
Well, even on those questions of visibility, symbolism, rites and rituals, even diet, you speak in your book about the difficulties that some of your participants, or many of the participants perhaps, were facing. I think Amber was one of the aliases you used. And the emotion that she was feeling really comes across in your writing. In fact, I'd say it comes across so powerfully that it betrays your own reflections in that.
Sympathies.
Yes. And so I'm wondering, to what extent did you see yourself going through that journey with your participants? And how did that impact in terms of your reflexivity? How did that impact your research?
Yeah, this is funny, right? We often, in the social sciences, we often ask the question about positionality, right? Where do you position yourselves? And so as a social scientist, I don't need to claim that I'm neutral, right? I'm not a positivist. I don't need to claim that I'm neutral. I am very much invested in their struggles, while at the same time being somewhat of an outsider, being a little bit marginal. I didn't grow up in America. I grew up in Pakistan. I grew up in an immigration country. I was older than them, so I was coming from a different context in many ways. But at the same time, when it came to the struggles, I could certainly identify with them. So when Amber talks about the struggle of wearing hijab, for example, after 9/11 and being very surveilled and being watched for her opinion, and then her opinion being dismissed as a product of bias, right? So if you're a Muslim, you're an insider, and your perspective on Islam or Muslims or the Middle East or anything related is not reliable, right? So then what do? First of all, we put you on the spot and we say, what do you think, right? Brown person wearing hijab. And then we hear them and we say, oh, well, obviously she's going to say that. So she's wearing hijab. She's completely subjugated, right? And she is brainwashed or something, as if not wearing hijab makes you automatically the opposite of those things, right? So definitely when I was, and this is funny because even though I grew up in Pakistan, when I decided to wear hijab, because I did for many years, at the age of about 14 or 15, I faced a lot of struggles in Pakistani Muslim society, where this was considered to be sort of, obscurantist and like not cool. you live in a city, you speak English, why are you doing this? Those kinds of things. What will you do when you get married? This doesn't look right, doesn't look nice. So similar kind of internalization of the colonial gaze happened in Pakistan as well. So I did identify with their struggles.
So that resonance you recognized with
I
it.
do, yeah.
Is there any way you could put your finger directly on aspects of your ethnography? Like I said, and this is why my ethnography was shaped in XYZ way, or why my research was carried out in this way, because of that very, position that I was in.
That's a good question. I think it would be I'm woven throughout it. I don't think that's like,
and that, to be fair, that comes across,
right? Yeah, I think that's part of the project of ethnography, or should be, right? Is that your history, and this is why I talk about myself in the beginning of the book. I don't hide. I personally have a great dislike for work that hides the author, because you're still there, even if you don't own up to it. And then all you're doing is you're hiding, right? And I prefer to be upfront. Here I am. Here are my biases. Here is my conditioning. And here's my argument. Now take what you will of that, right? So the reader should be able to make those decisions. And if the reader decides this is a person whose history means I shouldn't take her conclusions for granted, go for it. The text is yours.
So you spoke just now about your own experiences with hijab, and some of your participants, of course, being female Muslims. Hijab was something unavoidable. So I recall Khiyabani's article, for example, when he writes about how it's impossible to talk about Muslim women without reference to the veil. And that became very obvious in your book as well. It's a big part of Muslim visibility when it comes to female Muslims. You spoke about the hijab as a kind of marker of culture, marker of identity, marker of their Muslimness. I know rather, that you also teach a module on Islamic law at the college there. If I were to bring these two things together, we know that classical Islamic law is derived scripturally, primarily. In today's day and age, where hijab wearing, observance / non-observance, has become such a huge marker, especially in diasporic contexts, is it fair to say that looking at the jurisprudence of hijab only through scripture is somehow reductive? Where we don't allow the sociology and anthropology to play its direct role in that conversation?
I agree with that. And I really like how you put that.
I mean, the socio-political issues, which, of course, the scripture wouldn't, in that context, in 7th century Arabia, wouldn't have to deal with.
Right. But yet are part of the Quranic text.
Indeed.
Even the political and cultural context, when the Quran talks about so that they are not, so that they are recognized and not harassed, right? So definitely that argument is even part of the Quranic context. There are different perspectives that you can take on that, on hijab, and there have been different perspectives that are taken on that. I would say that probably the majority of Sunni jurisprudence would say that covering the head is required. Probably. I would assume that Shia, a majority consensus, would also argue the same thing. In my book, when I talk about hijab, I don't deal with the theological argument. It's not of my concern. It is, for a Muslim, it is your concern. You make your decision. It's between you and God. It is my concern how these young women make their decisions and then are pushed this way and that, or it is used against them. So that is my concern. So, for example, in the book, I talk about something. It sounds a little like cheesy, but I talk about healthy identity construction, right? So I talk about the ability of young Muslim American college students, women, to engage in a healthy process of identity construction. What that means is that there is not too much symbolic violence against them, that they can make those decisions, right? Obviously, we know that nobody freely makes any decisions, right? Like most of us have structural and cultural pressures upon us, and that sort of that agentic process is part of the negotiation of these things, right? So what these young women do, what each of these young women do, is their business, very much. It's not my concern. But I do think that the process of Islamic law does and should incorporate the sociological, the cultural experience of being a human being within a culture, and what it costs, or what it accomplishes, what an act accomplishes or does not, right? So I do believe that those things should play a role in the larger process of Islamic legal thought, and that to purely construct it on the basis of specific textual references is not enough. And the reason for that is also because when we talk about hijab, we're not only talking about particular verses related to hijab. We're talking about, for example, a larger Quranic argument about human life, right? So we don't separate hijab and say there's a scarf thrown into the religion, right? No, we talk about the larger context of being a human being in this cosmos of gods, right? And I mean God with an apostrophe, obviously, not many gods. La ilaha illallah. So being a human being in this world as a Khalifa, right? And living out that life in the best way possible. What is the meaning of modesty within that? What is the meaning of modesty as translated to this particular cultural context, where, for example, hair is considered very alluring? What about this other cultural context where hair is not considered to be very alluring, right? So my husband and I, we have this kind of thing about, I say, why don't you ever look at my eyes and say how beautiful my eyes are? And he says, well, I'm American. We don't do that. We don't really do that. It's different. And like when we talk about beauty is a very culturally subjective thing, right? So how can modesty not be a culturally very subjective thing, right? And obviously when you talk about, like, for example, Islamic legal thought coming out of the 10th century or the 12th century, of course it's going to be part of that milieu as well. So yeah, we got to do the work now is basically what I'm saying.
One of the things you touched on just a moment ago, still on the subject of hijab, you speak about in your book how it's used as a space to interrogate, to challenge, and even rank the Muslimness of some of your participants' identities. But on the flip side, could you perhaps also see emerging the space of hijab observance, stroke non-observance, as an agentic space in itself?
100%. As
a pushback?
100%. Absolutely. And this is actually, for me, a great loss when I stopped wearing hijab, is that the sort of the agentic digging your heels in and saying, I am here and this is who I am, is lost to me as somebody who doesn't wear hijab, right? The other thing is solidarity. The solidarity between women who wear hijab and with people who are in solidarity with women who wear hijab, as somebody who stands in resistance to the broader culture. Now, when you talk about resistance to the broader culture, right now there are, of course, student demonstrations going on Columbia campuses, and I can see the development of a solidarity that can include hijab, that it can include a standing up against capitalism, against a genocide in Palestine. And so this can be a larger agentic process of an agentic culture, right? And definitely symbols like hijab can very much be, say, for example, how the keffiyeh has been treated, how the Palestinian flag, watermelon stickers, etc. All of these things can definitely serve as symbols as well as agentic spaces for the development.
So this is what I was alluding to, that this whole socio-political value that the hijab has grown to have is sometimes missing in that conversation of jurisprudence. When you don't see
I agree
that
with you.
being factored into it.
I agree with you. And in fact, so for example, in some of my spaces where, for example, Muslim feminists talk about hijab, and we talk about, for example, the Iranian state requiring it, or the Saudi state requiring the covering, and this is wrong. Now, in those contexts, it's absolutely wrong. Right? Because it is not an agentic decision. It is not a free will decision by women. It is forced upon them by men, really. And so it is not a religious act. It is not a religious act. It is an act of compliance to people, right? So there is that on the one hand. But when some Muslim feminists come in and say, well, this is why the hijab is not a helpful thing, because it can be used in this way. To me, that's the same argument as like fire is bad because it can be used to burn things down, right? No, it's not inherently that thing. It's how it's used by certain people. So, for example, I am a non-hijabi, and I would mess you up if you try to stop a woman from wearing hijab. Or try to mess with. Whenever I see women wearing niqabs, I feel very close to them, because I was a niqabi. I was a niqabi for 9 years of my own choice, and I really struggled to do it. My family was not into this. They were just like, what is going on? Why is our modern Western educated daughter gone to the dark side? And so I really struggled with that. It was a real struggle for me. And I found a great space of comfort in wearing niqab, particularly in a society where women are very objectified, and public spaces are not necessarily safe spaces. They are not safe spaces, and so you have to look at each space and its politics, its gender politics, because women are like the miner's canary. They can tell you what the gender politics are in a particular place. For example, if you have a Islamic scholarship conference or something, women will tell you, oh yeah, this is a tough place. It's going to be a tough place to be at, because the guys will congregate and then the women will be like, okay, great. Will somebody talk to me? It's like that. So women are the miner's canary. They can tell you what something is going to be like, right? Because they are marginal for the most part, and they will be able to, sense where something is being used against them or for them. So, of course, people have talked about, Fadwa al-Gindi, the anthropologist, talks about how the zenana, right, the women's space, is a space also of solidarity and of strength, right? It can be that. Where you talk about women's concerns, and you don't have to engage with the man saying, well, let me tell you what your concerns should be, right? So the women can talk on their own, and they can develop their own idea of what is important to them. So definitely covering, even at times gender segregationist, and I'm not really in favor of gender segregation in general, but I'm talking about diasporic context, Western diasporic context. But there is a space for those spaces that can be agentic and powerful.
And you speak about in the end of your book, in some of your conclusions, you really fight back against the idea that your female participants feel the burden to represent what it means to be Muslim, and they're carrying that burden, and that can have its own detriment on their identities and some of the conflicts they feel and burden they feel because of that. Playing devil's advocate again, as Muslims, male or female, a bearded individual or a hijab-wearing woman perhaps, don't we have a responsibility to represent that identity of Muslimness to the wider campus context and beyond?
Let me play devil's advocate against this widespread belief that we are responsible and that each Muslim is responsible for conveying like the truth of Islam and Muslimness and the legitimacy of being a Muslim and the good things about Muslim history. It's too much. It's too much to carry. And it always, that project is always carried on under the post-colonial subjugation that we all experience. It is always a reaction. It is always a response to the interrogation by dominant Western gaze. Typically, the question that is asked, why do you oppress your women? Or why do Muslim women have to wear hijab? Or why did the Prophet blah, 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 whatever, insert whatever, right? Typically, those questions are racist. They're coming from a racist context and they are steeped in racism. Do not answer them, is what I say. This is my perspective. I know I'm going to be a minority perspective. And I know that especially in diasporic contexts, people think that their very survival depends on representation. I would say it's not going to help. I would say that representation has been tried and has been twisted and does not help. I would say strengthen your community spaces and strengthen your coalitions and your solidarities with people who stand alongside you. Do not try to satisfy racists, because you are wasting your breath. People who are racist will remain racist. And if they are not racist, they're going to figure the truths out, right? Secondly, the other thing that the burden of representation does is that it forces you into we're not bad, we're good, right? Which is another way of essentializing Muslims.
Sure.
Right? So they'll say, oh, you're all bad, you're evil, you're misogynist, you're this, you're that. And then you respond with, no, we're actually good. And look, our history is full of blah, blah, blah. And 1400 years ago, Muslims gave women their rights, etc., etc. And then what does that do? That actually papers over the struggles that we face within our communities. And that turns us into enemies of our own internal improvement. So that we say, no, don't talk about domestic violence. This is not the time. We are struggling for survival. The non-Muslims are watching. And we can't keep doing this to ourselves, because what that does is it destroys us. It turns us into cardboard objects, two-dimensional cardboard cutouts, which are presented for Islam Awareness Week or whatever else, right? And so then we are saying we are good Muslims, we have scientists, we have that guy who did the eye, like biology and things like that. So we trot all of those things out in order to prove our humanity. It's very harmful to be constantly proving your humanity. It's actually personally harmful to you. If you are in conversation with people who force you to prove your humanity, do not stand with them. Because that's trauma and that's very toxic. Avoid those. Protect yourself, protect your heart, and protect your mind from those things. do not constantly be. I understand that a certain degree of work in regard to correcting the facts. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that you should do that when you feel like you're in a good place to do that. I don't think every 18-year-old who goes to college should jump into responding to all the questions. This is not your job. Your job is study.
So this dynamic of Muslimness being scrutinized by a Western context.
Yeah.
You carried out your ethnography on campus, as did I in my research.
Yes.
Would you say that the campus context, keeping that wider milieu in mind, is a microcosm of the wider society, or are these debates hyperized on the campus because of the particular context of campus? And that's just out there for would-be ethnographers looking at, well, campus seems like a very interesting setting,
Yeah, I think you're right. That it is somewhat hyperized. I'm trying to think of a better word for it, but hyperized is it?
I think I made it.
So I think you're right in that the nature of higher education, because it's where you do study, right? Because where you analyze things. And then once you're done with that and you get into your jobs and you stop analyzing things, right? These 4 years, that's it. No more, not after that. So I think that this is a place where also students become divided into their specific populations, demographic populations, right? So, for example, for many students, even in my research as well, many students came to college and met a group of Muslims for the first time, right? And so this was very good for them. They felt like, wow, okay, so I can actually sit and talk about Islam with fellow Muslims and it's okay. Oh my God, what a relief, right? And and then, of course, forming these like Islamic societies or Muslim student associations, these type of associations with fellow Muslims, being able to do an iftar together, things like that are very beneficial for students who are minorities and so on. And this is the job of higher education, to ensure I would say to some degree, the safety of these marginalized populations.
What happens, however,
campuses, exactly, yeah.
What happens, however, is all the discussions we've had so far are magnified on that campus, and then can be more burdensome, perhaps, for the Muslims who are on that campus rather than those who are outside of that campus. Yes,
and especially depending on who your professors are. Because I've seen that too. Like if your professor is an Islamophobe, you have a hard semester ahead. You're a professor in Islamophobe and you're wearing a hijab, forget about it. And nobody's coming to help you for that, because that struggle is not visible, right? That is not a struggle that is going to be visible. Nobody's going to say, your professor is a Zionist who is constantly making fun of Muslims and constantly making fun of your practices, for example. Let us help you. No. Is Biden going to start a task force against that? No, likely not. It really is a struggle. And I feel very, I personally feel very protective of young people who are going through the struggle and who have really nobody caring for them. So when our professors right now in the United States are standing up and saying, hands off our students, they're literally calling the cops on our students for protesting with their conscience. And I just find nothing good about this scenario. So this is a kind of a broader struggle for the soul of higher education that I see. And I'm not sure to what extent Western higher education is prepared for this struggle.
Well, this protectiveness that you feel for people in that situation, let me say that your research and the award-winning book is a big step, right, in that project. And it was a fascinating book, a fascinating insight into your research context and into yourself, if I might add that comes
oh no.
With the book. So thank you so much for your time today and for the book itself. And of course, I'm going to urge all of our viewers that when they do purchase the book, they also subscribe to this to the Learn Life with all that whatever happens there, and they'll find a fascinating ethnographic research in that project you've carried out. So thank you once again for your time today.